As we move into June, what's happening with the real estate market here in Georgia? So, we're going to be covering all things happening in our market, kind of a market update for what we're seeing happening right now. My name's Alan Richardson. I'm the managing broker here at Maxwell Realtor Partners. And I want to kind of jump into what we're seeing happen in the market because always, anytime that we talk to clients, it's always going to be how's the market, how's the market, how's the market. And rather than just relying on people's feelings, which is what, granted, we're people too. Sometimes news, things like that can really sway us just like it can sway anybody else. But let's look at really what are happening with the numbers so that we understand what's happening in our marketplace and truly just look at the data rather than necessarily the feelings. Now, one of the big changes that we've got going on this year, and we've seen it happening all year, is really what's happening with inventory. Overall, inventory nationwide is actually up pretty significantly. We aren't necessarily nationwide back to where we were pre-COVID, that kind of thing, and we aren't necessarily in Georgia either. And I'll talk about that in just a minute. But the whole idea here is that this year inventory really is changing the market because residential real estate is heavily influenced by supply versus demand. If you can remember, if those of you that were in the market back in 21, 22 kind of thing, we had huge demand, not enough supply. Well, now we're having where supply is matching up, and it's really causing people to just kind of get really uncomfortable. Anytime we have a shift, people get really kind of antsy, right? Buyers agents don't really understand how much power they do or don't have. A lot of our sellers still think it was how it was 2 years ago, those kind of things. So let's kind of look at really what are we talking about here when it comes to inventory. So overall, in total active listings and so in order for me to pull this data, just so you understand, I'm pulling from the Georgia Multiple Listing Service as well as First Multiple Listing Service. So I'm pulling this number directly from the MLS, and it's as of right now. So overall, total active listings in Georgia MLS this year versus last year is up 32%. So 32% is a pretty big jump in total inventory. Now in FMLS, it's even more stark because we have 41% more total listings right now in FMLS than we had a year ago. Now, what's really fueling that is what's going on with new listings. So right now we have about, in Georgia MLS, we have 14, almost 15, 14.6. So almost 15% more inventory or more new listings coming on the market right now than we did a year ago. In First Multiple Listing Service, we have 8.6% more new listings coming on the market. Now, it's very easy to see that, goodness, when we have that much more inventory coming in, there's going to cause a shift in, due to supply versus demand. So overall, in the whole state of Georgia, we are sitting at 40% more active inventory this year versus last year. And so 40% is a pretty stark jump. And that's causing some effects in our pricing, right? Because 40% more listings this year than last year, that is going to cause a shift. There's no doubt. Now, when you look at it big picture, step back and look at what's really happening in the marketplace. Well, where are we, say, pre-COVID? Our total inventory versus where we were five years ago, basically. And so here in Georgia, we're still down 12%. So our total inventory, the total number of homes that we have for sale, are still 12% less than what we had going into COVID. And so basically, in a span of 5 years, we are starting to come back to normal, right? And that's the thing is that you would think some folks' heads were about to pop off. We are still haven't met the inventory levels, and if you remember where we were, pre-COVID, we still were. It wasn't necessarily a balanced market then, necessarily. So, but we are seeing a pretty significant shift, and anytime we see that kind of shift, it's definitely going to impact overall pricing. It's going to impact how our sellers react, how our buyers react, those kind of things. So you can see that, like pre-COVID, we would have around 50,000 listings this time of year, or 51,000 listings. Right now, we have about 45,000 listings. And so, are we back all the way there yet? No. But are we really heading towards a balanced market? We absolutely are heading towards a balanced market. And that's going to cause a shift, okay? Because we're going to have a shift between our buyers as well as our sellers, buyers agents, listing agents, that kind of stuff. The other thing that this inventory is causing to happen is something that we haven't seen for years. Now, for those of us that have been in the business for a long time, we've been through a bunch of different markets, but for, especially some of our new realtors and that kind of stuff, they don't understand what happens when this market moves like this. And so what we have right now is we have almost half of our listings, 44% roughly, of our listings are sitting on the market for over 60 days. That is a pretty significant shift from where we've been for the past 4 or 5 years, right? In the past 4 or 5 years, so long as it was priced anything reasonable, it was moving pretty good, right? And so we're seeing where this has caused a real shift. So when you look at almost half of our listings are sitting on the market for at least 60 days, I mean, if the average is, over 60 days, that means we got a lot sitting on the market 90 days, that kind of stuff. There is a shift in perception, and honestly, so much of it is really, really affecting our pricing. So right now, nationwide, supposedly, lately there was a recent study by Redfin. They said there's over $331 billion worth of stale inventory, properties that have been on the market over 60 days. And so this has created an opportunity here in Georgia, because for buyers, for example, in the past, we were just our buyers are looking at what's new coming in the market. You may have some stuff that's been sitting on the market that may be a lot more open to negotiation, to looking at their price, that kind of stuff, because we have a large group of inventory that is sitting on the market. Now, remember that we are like every market is still super local, right? $700,000 in Sandy Springs is going to be very different than $700,000 in Griffin. Okay, what your money's going to get you in different places, what's happening in the different markets. I'm just giving you some basic numbers overall for like the state of Georgia and that kind of stuff. So please understand that there's still going to be some differences, when it comes to your local market. But overall, this is a shift that we're seeing happen throughout the state of Georgia right now. We're having more inventory coming on. Now, where the inventory is coming in, it's coming in across the board, but we are seeing where there's a lot of inventory coming in the higher pricing tiers, in our higher end markets. So we're seeing a lot more of a buyer's market up there. Now, we're not seeing as much. We are seeing inventory come in more in our starter markets as well, but not quite as much. We're not seeing as big of a shift in our starter markets as we are in our higher ends. So that's going to definitely continue to impact our market as we move forward here. See, what we're really seeing is that because we have more inventory coming on the market, because we're moving towards a more balanced market, what's that happening to prices? We're seeing where prices are really kind of flat, kind of depending on which MLS we're looking at. And so like inside Georgia MLS, pricing is up 0.4%. So, less than 0.5%. And FMLS overall pricing is down 1.2%. Now, 0.4, 1.2, these are just normal market fluctuations in most normal markets. We're probably still going to finish in the 2 to 4% property value appreciation range for the year, but that's going to be little bits and pieces all the way along as we go through. What we're seeing is a very balanced market when it comes to a number of buyers and sellers are starting to match up much more closely. And when the buyers and sellers match up closely, we have to be ready for how that's going to impact our buyers and sellers. And what I mean by that is for our sellers, always, and I'm not trying to be judgy, but let's just be honest, most of our sellers will be very much, it's a seller's market, I can do what I want. And then the market tends to straighten them out. The challenge for us as, especially as listing agents is, the early bird may get the worm, but a lot of times it's a second realtor that sells the house, because we will take a listing and not really talk about what's happening with pricing. We have to talk about what's happening with pricing and how pricing is really pretty flat. And a lot of our sellers have this expectation that real estate goes up 8-10% a year, when realistically real estate goes up 4.4% a year for the last 50 years, right? So we're moving into a much more normal range. We're over the last 5 years we've had 50% property value appreciation here in Georgia. That's not normal. We're not going to have that in a normal market kind of thing. So just moving forward and kind of like communicating with our clients, we have to make sure they understand. For our buyers, though, we now are starting to have some buyers that are starting to feel like, well, this is a buyer's market. I can ask for ridiculous things. It hasn't shifted that way either. The days of like, I'm going to throw in a bunch of lowball offers and see who takes, we're not seeing that happen either. We're seeing where pricing is really pretty flat. And so that means that, is there some opportunities in places? Absolutely. Are there some sellers that are going to negotiate a little bit more? True. Are you going to be able to go in and just kind of dictate price as the buyer from the very front end? In most cases, no. Good properties in good areas in good condition, those will always be quick to sell. And there's always going to be a lot of competition for those homes. So just understanding your market, that kind of stuff is going to be really, really important. Overall, with everything happening in our market, there is a lot of market forces out there. Even though supply versus demand is definitely a big mover, we have a lot of things happening in our markets, in our government, all that kind of stuff. And sometimes that just leads to affecting us overall in the real estate market. What we're seeing is right now, pending sales are down right at 10%, 9.9% in Georgia MLS, 10.3% in FMLS. Here at the brokerage, we're actually running pretty flat with last year. We've actually been up a little bit this year versus last year, but that's just kind of, I'm glad that we're bucking the trend, but overall, statewide right now, we're running about 10% down. And so, that's kind of, pending sales is kind of what we see kind of moving forward. Closed sales, the total number of transactions in Georgia MLS last month was down 4.5%, and FMLS it was down 8%. So we are seeing where that's been equating into transactions. The other thing we're seeing here is that days on market has shifted a lot. We have much higher days on market than we have in the past. Everybody tracks it a little bit differently, but in Georgia MLS, we're sitting on 61 days on market, and FMLS, we're sitting on 41 days on market. That's up about 30%, this year versus last year where it was. Last year we were closer to 35 days on market. Now we're sitting at around 61. But that also we need to be able to carry that number and that data to our sellers. A lot of there was, for years now, we've had sellers who are like, well, when I get in 10 offers, I'll just decide which one then. And so the idea, and we're moving into that normal market where how many offers do you need to sell a home? You need one, right? That you need one that the buyer and the seller are waiting to agree on. We still have a lot of sellers that are expecting, oh, there's going to be 10 offers coming on my property. I only want to take all cash. Like when we see that the days on market are increasing, inventory is increasing right now, we need to be realistic with them and trying to help them set realistic expectations of what we're seeing happening in our marketplace. Now, overall, our absorption rate, meaning the number of homes that are getting bought and sold every month, it's actually kind of like from this month to last month is actually very, very steady. So we're running in Georgia MLS, we're running around 5 months of total inventory that we have on hand. In FMLS, we're sitting at 4.8 months. We need 6 months for a true balanced market. Well, you're never going to have a true number there because it's based heavily on the pricing tiers. High, middle, low. Our entry market is going to be a little bit different, but overall, total inventory, we're sitting on about 5 months of standing inventory. So just kind of take that into account, as we're talking to our clients about what, setting those expectations, that kind of stuff. Now, one thing that we haven't talked about yet is what's going on with mortgage rates. And so mortgage rates have kind of been flopping. I mean, we were heading in a very positive direction, and then all of a sudden, all the market turmoil and all the things happening with tariffs and all this other kind of stuff, and a lot of talk in the markets really caused what it caused was it caused the 10-year Treasury to go nuts, which our 30-year mortgage rate is tied directly to the 10-year treasury. And so we're sitting on, in the high sixes, 6.8, 6.7, somewhere in that range is where you're going to see most of your interest rate mortgages coming in right now. The good news is that we're actually seeing some positive numbers that should lead to interest rates softening a little bit more, which will change the market again. That right now. So right now, the numbers that are really affecting us is that overall inflation is actually looking better. I know it never feels like it's looking better. It never feels like, oh, okay. And that's because you think about how the prices were 3 years, 5 years, 2 years ago, that kind of stuff. It's never going to go back there. But the amount of inflation from this year to last year, like it's right at 2.1%. It's not below 2, which is where the Fed wants it, but it is sitting at 2.1%, and that is a pretty significant move. And so, as we see inflation, if you will, like historically, check what happens. The way inflation goes, that's the way interest rates go. And so, the other thing that's kind of going on right now is what's happening with the job market. And so we saw and it sounds weird to think that, hey, if jobs are worse, it's better for interest rates. You would figure it would go the other way around, but it doesn't necessarily, because the Fed sees jobs as inflationary. And so, the JOLTS, came out, job openings and labor turnover. And so that showed that those are rising. ADP, which is a huge employment company, they showed that even weaker job growth. And then the BLS report came out, and it's kind of flat from where it was. And so we're seeing where all these are other factors, and then we have less talk of what's happening with tariffs. We see some things kind of calming down a little bit. I'm not political. I'm not trying to get political, but like, just one of those things that once the markets calm down a little bit, it is better for the interest rates. Again, all these factors influence the 10-year treasury. And so when the 10-year treasury goes down, mortgage rates goes down. And so that's kind of what we're looking at, moving forward over the next, throughout the summer and into the early fall. We should start seeing a little bit more softening, hopefully moving into the mid sixes, that kind of stuff, as far as it comes to interest rates. So if that's kind of what we see happening in our marketplace right now. If I can be of any kind of service, please call, text, smoke signals. I don't really care. Glad to help in any way I can. Hope you guys have a great week and use this data, please, to help your clients. Have a great week.